Our next speaker actually doesn't really need an introduction because everybody knows her, Venita Datta, who received her PhD in French Studies at NYU and is currently, as we know, a professor of French Studies at Wellesley College. Her latest book was Birth of a National Icon, the Literary Avant-Garde. Oh, I'm sorry, that was your first book. Birth of a National Icon, Literary Avant-Garde and the Origins of the Intellectual in France, which was followed by Heroes and Legends of Fin de Siècle France, Gender, Politics, and National Identity, that came out in 2011. And her current book project, Figures of Modernity, which her work today is from, French-American Encounters from 1880 to 1914. And the title of your paper today, Aristocratic Masculinities on the Global Frontier, the Marquis de Morès and Theodore Roosevelt.
I'm just going to put my water here. I have to find a place for this because most women don't have pockets. So I have to put it here, I guess. Apparently there's a podcast about it. At any rate, in 1883, two young men made their way to the Badlands of North Dakota. The first was French aristocrat Antoine Amédée Marie Vincent Manca Ama de Vallombrosa, the Marquis de Morès, and the second, future American President Theodore Roosevelt. Morès, seeking opportunities in the cattle industry, established a meatpacking business and founded a small cattle town named after his wife, Medora. Roosevelt initially went out west to hunt, eventually buying 2 ranches during his stay there. Despite their different trajectories, Morès and Roosevelt were both shaped by the American West, which gave free rein to their desire for freedom, adventure, and predilection for violent encounters with both the land and the animals. Indeed, both subsequently went big game hunting. Morès in India, Roosevelt in Africa. While Theodore Roosevelt used his time in the West to remake his effete patrician Eastern persona, eventually becoming a cowboy warrior in the White House, Morès, already a military man, was unable to adapt his French aristocratic identity to the egalitarian society of the American West. His failure in the American cattle business no doubt spurred him to violent anti-Semitic agitation in France and eventually to an ill-fated expedition from Tunisia to Libya. En route, he met his heroic end, killed by local tribesmen in 1896, but not before firing off several rounds against his assassins, becoming a martyred hero for many on the nationalist right. For both men, the American West was part of a global frontier, not only a training ground for an elite masculinity adapted to the challenges of modernity, but also for the type of race-based nationalism they espoused, which moreover sought new frontiers to conquer. And in this paper, I will examine the role the American West played first and foremost in the life and career of Morès. I am, after all, a French historian. Yet, the case of Theodore Roosevelt, who knew and sometimes clashed with Morès out west, offers us an important point of comparison. The experiences of the two men afford us the opportunity not only to examine the role the American West played in shaping one French man's identity, but also the construction of upper-class French masculinity at the fin du siècle, and its intersection with American masculinities at the very moment that a new ideal of American hegemonic masculinity was being forged in the West. Their tenure out west also allows us to explore the tensions of Gilded Age America, notably the rise of and role of Easterners and foreign noblemen in the cattle industry, along with geographic and class tensions that played out between these two groups and Westerners. The Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877, which pushed Native Americans and buffaloes off the land, along with the incursion of railroads out west, gave rise to a booming cattle industry in the 1870s and 1880s in the northern plains. The cattle industry attracted the interest not only of Easterners like Roosevelt, but also of foreigners, especially English aristocrats like the Fruin brothers, as well as Morès, whose father-in-law was a Wall Street banker. Morès married American heiress Medora Hoffman in 1882, but not for her money. Like other elite men, Morès was attracted by the promise of easy money and the romanticism of the wilderness. Writing to a friend about the West, Morès declared, "I like this country because there's room to turn around without stepping on the feet of others." Morès and other elite men, among them Roosevelt, also headed west for its regenerative powers and as a way to assert or remake their masculinity. Morès, however, differed slightly from these men. Rather than limiting himself to ranching, he sought to make money in the dressed beef business, seeking to eliminate middlemen in Chicago by slaughtering the beef on the range and then shipping it to points west and east. And although the location that Morès had chosen was ideal, he thought too big, expanding his business before it had even taken off. And when the whole scheme business seemed to be falling apart in 1886, Morès decided to enter the retail business in dressed beef, thereby putting him in direct competition with Armour and Swift, who soon squeezed him out. While ranching might have seemed to be an appropriate career for elite American and foreign men, few had the appropriate business skills to succeed. During the years that Theodore Roosevelt and Morès lived in Medora, the frontier was on the cusp of change. While the railroads and the arrival of big ranchers from the East Coast and abroad had opened up the West, their presence on the frontier also announced the beginning of the end of the open free range, particularly after the brutal winter of 1886 to 1887, which led to the death of millions of cattle and the subsequent closing of the range. And at the same time, both the image and the ideal American male and the cowboy were changing. A new rough and ready type motivated by primitive masculine instincts and physical prowess increasingly replaced the old archetype of the ideal male represented by the gentle Victorian patriarch. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the rise of industrialization and urbanization and the development of urban leisure led some middle and upper class men to feel overly civilized. The myth of the West, in particular the figure of the rugged individualist of the West, thus became an antidote to urban malaise. Nowhere was the dynamic of American masculinity more manifest than in the ideal of the cowboy, who embodied the American spirit. A national aristocrat, he was a knight imbued with chivalric qualities, who had triumphed over the land and Indians. The cowboy, however, was not always a heroic figure. In the 1860s and 1870s, a cowboy was a herder, often uncouth. Yet, it was at this very moment that the heroic cowboy of Westerns came into being, in part through dime store novels and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The case of Roosevelt, who did much to publicize his own evolution from Eastern dude to a seasoned, manly Westerner, is worth pondering, not only because Roosevelt and Morès sometimes clashed with each other, but also because they shared a number of traits. Theodore Roosevelt first came to the Dakota Badlands to hunt buffalo in September 1883, just a few months after Morès' arrival there. He returned in August of 1884 in the wake of the deaths of his wife and mother. For Roosevelt, the West provided both an escape from the tragedy he'd suffered and a restorative for his mental and physical health. Before his foray out west, Roosevelt was seen as an effete Eastern politician, with newspapers regularly casting aversions on his masculinity. 5 years later, he'd become the cowboy of Dakota. And I'm going to show you two photographs, and you see the first of them. And the photographs illustrate his transformation from effete Easterner to hardened cowboy. In this first photo that you see, a studio portrait from around 1884, Roosevelt is seated, and noteworthy is the dagger tucked into his ammo belt, which was made by artist designer Louis Comfort Tiffany. Exactly. Best known for his jewelry and stained glass items, hardly the stuff of rugged Western heroism. In the second image, okay, it's this one. It's a year or two later, and Roosevelt is posed against his horse in Medora on the roundup. And while he wears glasses, his hand is on his holster and he looks ready for action. No longer the New York dude who was all teeth and eyeglasses, in the words of the journalist from the New York Times. During the next few years, Roosevelt remade his image into a Western cowboy and an icon of the nascent ideal of Western masculinity. Roosevelt saw himself as a hero of his class, a new rancher from the East Coast who was part of a sporting aristocracy, for whom ranching was not a business of dirty money-making, but rather an occasion for heroic masculine display. Moreover, he linked his own personal narrative to that of the nation, namely the conquest of the West and the need to conquer new frontiers, notably in his 1899 speech, The Strenuous Life. In The Strenuous Life and other writings, Roosevelt exhorted his fellow Americans to pursue imperial conquest in aid of the march of civilization and for the grandeur of their country. Even if the image of the cowboy was in a state of flux when Morès and Roosevelt arrived in Medora, the frontier mentality stood in stark contrast to European refinement and the notion of a feudal heritage associated with the aristocracy and monarchy. Furthermore, the ideal American male who acted based on his instinct was juxtaposed to the European male's theorizing and planning. As Richard Slotkin has observed, aggression and violence were an integral part of American masculinity, grounded in the narrative of conquering new lands and non-white peoples. While this ideal dovetailed to some extent with the French ideal of the colonial mission, French commentators, although they tacitly recognize the necessity of violence on the ground, couched the colonial mission in lofty metaphors of peaceful conquest and postulated the ideal of the colonial hero who rejected violence. The French, too, experienced a crisis of masculinity in light of developments similar to those taking place in the United States. Industrialization, urbanization, the entry of women into the public sphere. But it was exacerbated by the loss of the Franco-Prussian War and the decline of the national birth rate. If in the American case a model of rugged Western masculinity emerged at this time, even co-opting Eastern elites, in France, the culture of the duel and the sword, originally associated with the aristocracy and the military, was democratized, spreading to the middle classes. The prestige of the army and military heroes notwithstanding, some members of the bourgeoisie denigrated aristocrats as idle, contrasting their inactivity to their own bourgeois work ethic. Aristocratic masculinity was ambiguous. On the one hand, it represented the exaltation of honor, chivalry, and military virtues. On the other, the aristocratic lifestyle associated with comfort, which was seen as contrary to masculinity, as was the Catholic piety of many aristocrats. For Morès, a nobleman and an army man, such an equivocal view of the aristocracy might well have been disturbing. Not only did he reject the idleness of his class, he claimed he needed to work to make something of himself. How did Morès's aristocratic French persona play to American audiences? And how did Morès himself shape his image to fit the norms of American masculinity? From an examination of photos and his interviews with the press, of which there were many, it's clear that Morès sought to balance two different images of late 19th century manhood, both of which he knew would captivate American audiences. In some ways, Morès fit the rugged masculine model of the West. As a military man, and in particular a former member of the cavalry, he rode well. He was also an excellent shot, and prided himself in his prowess as a hunter. And in this photo, taken in 1883, Morès is astride a black horse. Lean and rangy with a rifle slung over one shoulder, he's wearing a leather jacket and chaps, and an iconic cowboy hat. His strong, handsome face, replete with a black mustache, is looking off onto the horizon with the dynamic backdrop of the Badlands behind him. He appears to be the quintessential manly Western hero at one with his horse and gun, symbols par excellence of Western American manhood. Yet at the same time, he was a fine gentleman. In an 1884 piece from the New York Times, a journalist writing about one of the Marquis' visits out east noted that while he dressed like a cowboy out west, in the city he sported a well-crowned silk hat, gloves, and finely fitting shoes. The New York Times recognized this delicate balancing act. While praising his courage and shooting skills, the journalist described Morès as a fine specimen of manhood who looks as if he could hold his own against the worst cowboy that ever bestrode a Mustang. yet added that his manners were those of a perfect gentleman. Morès's birth and upbringing meant he possessed a good number of traits associated with the aristocracy, chief among them the sense of noblesse oblige and arrogance. According to his biographer Charles Boulaire, Morès, who saw himself as a man of action, repeatedly stated that his birth gave him no privileges, but rather conferred upon him numerous duties. Such an attitude could be expected to earn the approval of Americans, yet Morès managed to alienate many of those who lived in Medora. In common with Theodore Roosevelt, Morès came from an elite family and was an authoritarian personality. Nevertheless, Roosevelt succeeded in converting skeptics out west that he could understand them and even become one of them. Morès and Roosevelt as elite men had to steer a fine line between Western masculinity and their aristocratic identities. Furthermore, they were fascinated by and exploited violence, one of the defining features of the frontier, to fashion not only their own identities, but also in aid of their nationalist, albeit different varieties of nationalist ideologies. And finally, both were self-promoters, using the press to mold their images. In Drulaire's recounting, Morès believed that Roosevelt saw himself as the incarnation of the forces of progress of the American people, while according to the future American president, Morès felt that he had the divine right to change laws and customs to suit him. Therein lies the key, I think, to their different experiences out west. Roosevelt succeeded in adopting and adapting his aristocratic identity to the frontier because he kept his head down, lived simply in a log cabin, unlike Morès's more splendid residence, and stayed away from quarrels. And the fact that he was American allowed Roosevelt to better understand the egalitarian customs of the West and to clothe his aristocratic ideals in egalitarian rhetoric, a task that would have been nearly impossible for Morès. Americans did not always take kindly to foreign titled gentlemen, but most of the difficulties that Morès encountered had much more to do with his combative and boastful personality and his refusal to respect Western norms. Morès provoked and or blundered into several situations, notably his clash with 3 hunter/cowboys, which led to the death of one of them, Riley Lovesey, in 1883, and eventually a jury trial for murder in 1885, in which he was eventually acquitted. And by the way, my fellow panelist, Liz Everton, gave a wonderful paper on the topic at French Historical Studies back in 2013, a while ago. It was good, I remember it. Those who benefited from Morès's arrival in North Dakota liked the fact that he was going to build up the town. And indeed, in addition to his abattoir, he built a store, a livery stable, and a hotel. But by using Valentine scrip issued by the government to claim lands that had not been surveyed and filing claim on the land, he alienated residents who feared his appropriation of lands for his own personal use that they viewed as free and common to all. They also opposed his building fences on the open range, recognizing that they would restrict access to trails, especially those used by hunters and cowboys. The Lovesey murder case tells us about Morès's willingness both to consult the law and to defend himself by violent means if necessary, and thus uphold his honor. It also illustrates Morès's difficulty understanding that his title conferred upon him no privileges in the American West. On a larger scale, the confrontation reflects the changes taking place in the Badlands at the time. Other ranchers, too, sought to fence the land, earning the ire of old-style Westerners who wanted the range to remain open. Far from being an isolated paradise, North Dakota was very much a part of the global capitalist network of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Both Morès and Roosevelt went on to other careers and activities, including big game hunting, which they saw as an extension of their pursuits out west and as a way to prove their white manhood. But it was also an act of colonization, taming the land, savage beasts, and local peoples. In fact, Morès himself referred to his time in the West as colonization. While Roosevelt saw new imperial frontiers to conquer for the United States, Morès first attempted unsuccessfully to open up trade with China by building a railroad, and then headed back home to France, where he went on to pursue a checkered career in politics, playing an important role in the emergence of the anti-Semitic movement. And that's a paper in and of itself, and I have the archives to prove it. Having played up His aristocratic stature in the U.S., back home in France, Morès highlighted his cowboy credentials. Running for a seat in the municipal elections in the socialist district of Épinette in 1890, Morès described himself as a Democrat and socialist who had lived among the workers in the Badlands. His experience in the dressed beef business in the U.S. also earned him the loyal following of the butchers of La Villette, who became his shock troops in confrontations with political opponents. Morès dressed them up like cowboys with purple shirts and sombreros and equipped them, in the absence of rifles, with bamboo clubs topped by heavy steel balls. I'm going to show you this photo, and there's another one that's even better. This is a studio portrait taken in Paris in 1889, and Morès is dressed as a cowboy in light-colored chaps. He's got a gun in his holster, but it seems like a prop and his outfit like a theater costume. Furthermore, his mustache, which is quite dandified, is at odds with the rest of the Western persona. Unlike the first image that I showed you of him, Morès appears to be playing at being frontiersman. And here I've got another, I think this picture is actually better. Morès's American-style behavior shocked his French contemporaries, not only his association with those not of his class, but also his willingness to use physical violence. Morès learned to his chagrin that he could not brandish a revolver in a public meeting in France, as he could in the American West. He was fined 100 francs. His duels, especially the one in which he killed Captain Armand Meyer in 1892, made him seem overly aggressive and violent in the eyes of many. After a number of public humiliations in France, Morès undertook an expedition in 1896 from French-controlled Tunisia to present-day Libya, proposing to eventually establish a trade route for the French from northwestern Africa to the Sudan through the Sahara. In doing so, he also sought to restore France's lost honor by driving the English out of Africa, and in the process, perhaps also, to lay claim to the glorious role that had eluded him in America and back home in France. Until the end of his life, the American West had a huge impact on Morès, and indeed he referred to the Sahara as a new West in one of his last letters home to his wife. However, just as the imperious Morès had trouble fitting in the egalitarian frontier community of the American West, he had difficulty returning to the genteel, aristocratic society of France upon his return home. Unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who remade himself successfully as a Western cowboy and was at ease with this identity at home and abroad, Morès was a misfit and not at home anywhere. Too aristocratic for Americans, he was a traitor to his class in France. Too wedded to legal contracts and the law in the United States, despite his taking the law into his hands in a lovesick affair, he engaged in and advocated for activities seen as thuggish in France. Undeniably, Morès, like Roosevelt, was part of a global frontier and the embodiment of the nascent age of steamships, railways, the telegraph, and the mass press. Indeed, a figure of modernity. Thank you.